Okay, we've got a Squire 2 Stratocaster Fender. It's a contemporary. It's from Korean factory, from the Samick factory in '89. The problem is it's got a little bit of maple missing from behind where the nut goes. So we're just going to clean that up just a little bit, and got to be careful not to damage any of the existing wood that's still in good nick. We're just going to clean that surface up just a tad. Clean the glue off it that's there and smooth out the timber a little bit. And that'll give us a nice surface to put a replacement piece of timber in. Now, the only issue I've got is this is a maple neck, and for me to get hold of maple is not easy. So what I'm thinking of doing is I've got some cherry. Now the cherry I've got is actually been drying out for a few years now, and I've got an offcut from a box that I made out of it. Now, it was only a small piece of cherry, there wasn't a lot there. I think we can get a piece that's a reasonable match to this maple out of the cherry. The good thing about the cherry is it's got a reasonable amount of colour change, but the grain is not dissimilar in many spots to what's here. Now what we've got is quite a light piece, and as we can see, the cherry goes from quite a red out to a lighter colour. Now I've planed a little bit off this here, and that looks to be reasonably close to the maple. It's a little bit more yellow, but I'm not too concerned with that because I'm just going to put a clear lacquer over it once it's shaved back down. And I expect from that we'll get pretty close to the colour of the Squire. Now I'm not looking to actually hide the repair, that's not the intent, but at the same time we don't want it to stand out like a sore thumb. Now what I'm going to do is glue a piece in all the way, and the nut sits a little bit higher at this point. I've taken out the glue that was there, so we're actually sitting a little bit down. So what we'll do is we'll fill this in and then mould the timber back down to this same curve that matches the rest of the guitar across there, and we'll cut back down in here to reintroduce the slot through to the edge, just the right width for the nut, and that'll leave a reasonably solid glue joint there for what's left. So we should end up with a reasonable repair. Now the good thing about the nut itself is the forces on the nut are downwards. They're not actually pushing back. How this got broken in the first place in this spot, I'm not sure, but I would suggest it was because of a little bit of abusive attitude to the guitar around that point, or it's been dropped or something, don't know, but it was the only damage that it saw. So we're just going to clean that up and see what we can do about making it look respectable again. Like I say, the aim is not to actually hide the repair, it is purely to make it not stand out like a sore thumb, like a band-aid on this piece of timber, make it match reasonably well, but it'll also show that the guitar has had a life. A lot of people like relic guitars, so in a way it's kind of doing that relicking of this section of the guitar. It's not false relicking. It has been dropped, it has been damaged. The option would be to leave that damage there. The only problem is leaving that damage there may lead to further damage occurring around that area. By replacing the part, we actually help protect it from further spread of the results of that damage. So that section is cleaned up now. So what we want to do is put that aside and then cut a piece of this cherry. Probably there's a bit of checking there at the end, so we'll probably aim to get from around about here. It's a reasonably pale section of cherry on this side more than this side. There is a bit of darkness just here with a grain line, and then it gets darker and as it goes further along and moves up. So we don't want to touch that. We want to stay in this area here. We don't need a large piece, so we'll just grab a small section from around about there, wide enough to fill this gap, and glue it in, and then we'll start to mould it. Okay, we have trimmed that up. We have our piece of cherry. That this section here is what we're interested in. The top part of this will get trimmed back, so all of that dark section will disappear, and we'll end up with a nice clean paler section which flows through towards the back as it gets thin. That block sits nicely in place in the spot that we cleaned up. So once we glue that down, give it a day to really get solid, leave it overnight, and we'll come back tomorrow and start to clean that up and just trim it back section by section until we have a nice match to the existing profile of the head. Then we'll be able to clean it up, cut it in, make sure the nut fits, give it a lacquer, and won't look quite as knocked around as it currently does. We'll be able to get this back on the guitar, restrung, and it'll be back in play. So the trick here is to get the glue in place without getting it all over the fretboard. Fretboard being lacquered won't be too much of an issue because it'll just wipe off without any real drama, but we don't want to get excessive if we don't need to. So that's positioned where we want it. That's going to sit nicely. The issue we got is getting a clamp on that is not going to be easy. So we're going to go for the old clamping method that's tried and true. Good old masking tape. Might take a few bits just to get it and make sure it's in the correct place. Hold it down, get that masking tape in place, push it down, and slowly fold it around into the places we need it to hold. That'll be more than enough clamping pressure for something like this. It's not going to be holding a lot of force when it's back in play and in use, so we don't really need this to be under the weight of 10 bricks or lead weights or anything like that. It's just the equivalent of a hand holding it in place for an extended period of time. And rather than me standing there all night holding onto it, this will do fine. Never hurts to go a little bit overboard. The more you put on, the more pressure it does apply. Just make sure that's seated exactly where we want it. Pushed in good and tight, because we do want this to hold when we're chiseling it down, filing it down, cutting it down. However we end up doing that, we want it to hold nicely. So this might look a little bit overboard, but it gives me the peace of mind that I know this isn't going to slip and it's going to stay exactly where I put it. So we'll leave that overnight and we'll have a look at it tomorrow. Okay, day has passed. We'll peel all this tape off and see that the clamp has done its job. Like I said, doesn't need a lot of force, and that little block of wood has seated quite nicely into that socket that we chipped out. So the next step is to just cut this back a bit. Now I just want to take this easy and slow, and I've just got a coping saw here. I just don't want to get too close or be too aggressive. Normally I would do this in a clamp, give me a better control of the whole situation. But I don't have one set up at the moment, so we're just going to cut through very slowly. You can see roughly how it's going to go here. And we're going to make sure that we don't touch any current component of the guitar, and we'll just slowly and gently work our way through that piece of timber until we get it down closer to the existing level there, and then we'll slowly shave it down there. So we'll keep going a little bit, give you an idea of what we're looking, but as you can see, that little block is holding on quite nicely. We're almost through this first cut. The general attitude here is take it piece by piece until you get down to where you want to be. You don't have to cut it all off in one bite. Small bites is the easiest way to finish a big meal. So I'm going to take a little bit more here. And just get it started. Make sure we aim for that coping saw in between any hardware so that we don't cause any undue nicks, scrapes or anything that's going to possibly damage the strings at a later stage. So that's taken it down pretty close there. We've got a lovely bit out the edge of the guitar that we don't necessarily need, so we'll take a similar sort of attitude to that. I'll see if I can do this. Once again without a clamp, if I can get it started. Once you get it started, generally you're right. It's the getting it started is the hard part, and as you can see, that's just chipped off because we're going with the grain. So we want to be careful at this point. We don't want to chip it off unnecessarily. And now we'll just take it down on that angle, being really careful on that, not to take out any of the existing piece of the guitar. So we're just going to go real gentle, real slow, and there we have it. So at the moment we're looking pretty good. That little blowout, we're getting a bit closer to where we need to be. Now I think we have got a bit of a crack there, so what we might do there is just feed some glue in there, reclamp that, because that crack is just a tad inside of where we want to be. And this is one of the problems with working with really small pieces of timber like this. It can very easily crack. So we want to secure that before we get any further. The best way to get glue into a very fine crack like that is get yourself a very thin piece of plastic, cut it into a wedge, and that's just off a container from a blister pack packaging. So it's nothing fancy. And then we just want to check where that crack is, pull it apart just a little bit, put a dab of glue on top of where it is, and then take that plastic, just feed it down into that crack. The more we feed that in, the more we're going to have a good seal between those two pieces and bind them up when we pull them back together. So I'll just wipe that off onto the top, and then we get another piece of masking tape. Once again, using this as our clamp. Now I'm just going to pull it as tight as possible across the neck. It gave a little give there, it actually cut in the middle, so we'll double that up with another piece. Once again, tape it underneath, give it a little tug, and that will be enough pressure to hold that together until that seals. Okay, we're back again, that should be enough. So we'll remove our clamp, which now it'll still look a little bit wet on the top, but down inside that should have dried thoroughly by now. But we're going to stay away from that area just for the moment. We're just going to concentrate on just gently slicing small amounts at a time. Just in this direction. Essentially what we want to do is just rebuild that part of the neck that sits behind the bridge. Sorry, the nut. So just gently, bit by bit, pare that back. When we're getting close, we'll start to move around and just take off that point. And work in on the neck. So essentially this is just carving in very small portions. It's no different to carving anything else. You're just taking off a small amount of wood at a time. The aim is that you want to take off in small bites because it's easier to take off than it is to put back. Now, essentially we are putting back here, but if this was carving a whole neck in the first place, we wouldn't be having to do this gently. We'd have a not much bigger and more solid piece of timber to work with, and it'd be a lot easier to just come in and slice this away with a sander or a saw and just cut across the whole piece to what we want, sand it down and be done with when we've got it the shape we want. What makes this harder is we're trying to pare this down in a way that we're matching what was previously done as best as possible. Like I said before, we're not trying to hide, but at the same time we don't want it to look stupid. We want to have this ending up looking like equivalent quality of what was there in the first place. Now, as we come closer, we want to try and replicate that curve. Now what I'm going to do is essentially come in, matching that curve there, going to level it off on this side, going to make sure it's level across the top, and then we'll cut out the socket right here for the nut to sit back into its place. We'll glue the nut back in after we've come through. We've given it a sand, we've applied some lacquer, and we should end up with something that looks pretty reasonable. Now, it may seem like I'm not really taking any massive shavings off here, and to some extent I'm taking off less than I would, and that's simply because of the angle I'm trying to hold this to keep it on the camera for you. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go away and continue working on this and then bring it back and we'll see where we're at. But this just gives you an idea of taking off small amounts to bring it back to the level of what we had before. We don't know why it broke, how it broke. Picked this guitar up from a garage sale. It was at the end of the garage sale. Went for a bargain price. The person selling it wasn't the owner. Couldn't really tell us much about it, so we don't know the story. But what we do know is it's repairable. So I'm going to turn the camera off now and continue this in a fashion that I can actually take a bit more care and control around carving this back into shape. When it gets down to a certain level, we'll take a bit of sandpaper, curl it around a pencil to try and get that same curve, and we'll give it a little bit of a sand, and then we'll see where it's at when we get to that point before we start to apply some lacquer. Okay, we've taken it back. I've just given it a little bit of a sand with some fine paper. We've taken it back right to the curve, and some of the lacquer had chipped off when the original piece broke off down to here, and you can see that curve there. So we've just sanded in there a little bit to try and smooth that out a bit so that when we apply the new lacquer it doesn't stand out quite as much. We've also taken it back smooth on the side here, so you can see the lines really solidly at the moment, but that feels smooth. Best way to establish a joint like this is to feel it, because you're going to feel with your fingers things that you can't see with your eyes. With your eyes it may look like it sits up, or that this side sits up. You may feel a ridge there, but I can't feel a thing there. It's as smooth as anything. So given that it's that smooth, I know that we can just come over with that with the lacquer. So the next part is to carefully cut out the where the nut sits, the slot. So we'll do that with the coping saw, and we'll cut not quite to the same level. Essentially we'll cut just in a little bit, clear out the slot, come back with the chisel and just clean it up so that the nut fits just in there nicely. Okay, so we're back. We've got the curve sanded down, we've got the edge sanded down, we've cut the slot out for the nut, cut with the coping saw just a little bit in and then slowly worked the chisel in there. Now I've got the nut here. This is the nut that came out of this slot, so it should fit in nicely. We'll start with the side that we haven't touched and then we'll work in, and that's looking like a perfect fit. So as you can see, we have an obvious repair there. Not quite so obvious on the side, but it's still visible. What we'll do now is apply some lacquer. We'll try and find some that's similar sort of yellowing to it to try and bring that cherry close to the maple. There's a difference in the grain as we come down, which is going to be visible, and you will see those lines down and across. But like I say, this is repairing the functionality of the guitar, not trying to hide the fact that it's a repair. If it's trying to hide the fact that was a repair, we'd be trying to get some maple to match this, even if it was from a donor neck of another broken Fender with a maple neck, or some other guitar with maple neck, and trying to match the grain as much as possible and work on hiding it that way. It's not what we're trying to do. We know this guitar is been through the wars. We're slowly cleaning it up and fixing it up. The frets need some work. The body needed some work. All the screws were rusty. We'll come back and look at the body at another point, and you'll see the whole guitar back in its full glory. But as you can see, there's a little bit of rust still to take care of. It's surface rust, so we'll take this hardware off at some point and we'll hit that with the wire wheel and polishing wheel, and they'll come up nice. There's a little bit of rust on the screws down the bottom, but essentially what we're aiming for is a guitar that is saying, yes, I've been around, I've had some life, I've seen some use. It is from 1989, so it has seen 33 years of life. What it's done in those 33s, we don't know. But the one thing about the Korean Samick 89 guitars, the neck is a little bit thinner. It's a really nice neck. It's recognised as being a lovely neck to play. So we want to make sure that we bring this guitar back to a point of fully functional with an attitude of a stitch in time saves 9. Yeah, it's got natural dings and wear and tear, and you can see some here as well, which we might address those with a little bit of super glue or something and then just sand it back, polish it up. But for all intensive purposes, it's a good solid neck. No major damage, it's in good condition. So there's no reason this guitar can't go on for another 30 years or even more. This repair, if left unattended, would enable this bridge to, this nut to slop around, and with the strings pulling on this, that would lever, and you would find that there's a possibility that it would slowly chip across and work its way across, to the point that this would then be even more difficult to repair. But by capturing it here and replacing that small piece of timber now, we actually hold that nut in place and prevent any wobble from occurring as the strings are being bent. and the pressure is applied slightly backwards and forwards, that will hold it in place and that will prevent it from spreading any further, which is what we're aiming to do here. So the next step will be remove this nut again, lacquer it up, sand it, take a few coats of lacquer, and we'll come back and show you the finished product. Okay, we're now up to the stage where we need to seal what we've got. Now, given that this is a maple neck, I've got some Cabot's Stain and Varnish, which is maple gloss, and that should match him pretty well. Combine that over the cherry, which is not far off the colouring of the maple in the first place. This should blend it pretty well. Now, I don't expect it to hide the repair, but it should make it not stand out like a sore thumb. So we'll start off just by putting a little bit right on where the repair has occurred, and we want to seal it right through properly. You can see that the colouring of that is darkened up a little bit to what was there. What I've done is I've sanded it all the way back to 1500 grit, and the lacquer has actually sat in that cherry really nicely and blended it in pretty well. The camera shows it up pretty aggressively there, but without the camera out in the standard light, it actually blends a little bit better. So what we're going to do is just whack some wax polish on that, no more, and we'll just see how that comes up. So the expectation is that we should be able to get quite a nice little polish off this in the end. And that's actually looking really good. So we'll just give the whole neck and headstock a little bit of a rejuvenation, giving it a bit of a wax all over. But I'll start with this section here. I gave these first two frets a little bit of a sand too, just to try and take the feel of those dings out a little bit. So there, you can still see the dings, but it's been dramatically smoothed out. So we're just going to whack a nice big amount of wax over that. And this is basically just 50% beeswax and 50% linseed oil, boiled linseed oil, so it won't develop any darkness or anything from any bacteria or anything. So it's purely about getting that wax on. The linseed oil thins it out. Because it's already got a coat of varnish on it, linseed oil is not really going to soak in unless there are any cracks in the varnish that allow anything to seep through. Given for the most part that's not really a thing for this headstock. It's not really got any checking or anything in the lacquer, so it's not likely to have any opportunity for oil to seep through, except for those couple of places where there are dings. I'm expecting that we won't really see any benefit from the oil. So the oil itself then purely becomes a vehicle for the wax to be distributed. Ideally you'd whack this on a buffing wheel to get the best wax finish and polish, but we're just going to use the old elbow grease here and just keep it nice and simple, and we'll get a decent polish coming up out of that. These last couple of frets we'll probably end up doing a couple of coats on. We'll let them sit overnight, give them another buff with some paper, and then give them another coat. That's looking pretty good. And that repair has come up a lot better than what I was expecting it to. So we can see the repair's been done. You can see the lines of the repair. It's not hiding it, but it's blended in so well that when we put the nut back in, the focus is going to be the nut because that's black. So once you've taken the focus to the nut, this is going to disappear a little bit to the eyesight. But the main thing is that that's going to hold that section really well and prevent that from breaking away further along there over time as the nut wobbles. And it'll only be micro wobbles as the strings are depressed and bent, etc. But still there would be a wobble. And since there had already been breakage down to that point, over time it's likely that that would slowly extend down until this really wouldn't be holding the nut at all. So by putting this back into place and actually running it down a little bit, cutting a bit deeper with the chisel so that it runs right across, we've actually reinforced that to what it originally was. The glue in there will help reinforce it as well. But that, I'm pretty happy with. That's come up pretty well. So this will be allowed to dry. We'll get another buff just with some brown paper and paper towel, and that'll help remove any residual oils and then also help to polish the wax itself, leaving that in a pretty good state, so that all that will be left to do will be to give the frets themselves a bit of a crown and polish.